ECI provides cloud-based HCM solutions for small to mid-market companies in a variety of industries and is headquartered in Elkhart, Indiana, with another location in the greater Dallas, Texas area added this year. Welcome to our webinar entitled The Fair Labor Standards Act, the 2016 Overtime Amendments. This webinar will last about an hour, followed by 15 minutes for questions. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box only, which can be accessed by hovering over the floating toolbar in the upper middle portion of your screen when in full screen mode and clicking on the Q&A drop-down menu option. Our presenter, Stephen Weatherhead, will do his best to answer as many of your questions as time permits. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded, and a link to that recording will be emailed to you by next week. Also, this webinar is HRCI approved for 1 credit hour, and instructions for receiving that credit will be presented at the end of the session. At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Stephen Weatherhead. Steve is a partner and co-founder of Marathis, Barrow, Weatherhead, Lint, LLP, a Boston-based boutique law firm dedicated solely to advising employers on employment and employee benefits issues. He has spent the past 20 years advising employers in all industries and geographies about their rights and obligations under various federal and state employment laws, including the Fair Labor Standards Act. He also frequently represents employers in state and federal courts around the country in wage and hour litigation. He is a graduate of Bowdoin College and Harvard Law School. Now, with great pleasure, I introduce Stephen Weatherhead.
Thank you all for attending. What we're going to talk about today is the 2016 Overtime Amendments of the Fair Labor Standards Act. I'm sure you've all heard many things about this. They're highly controversial, very politicized. There's been a lot of ink spilled in the popular press, the mainstream press, industry trade, publications. This is probably one of the most controversial employment law rules that has come about, certainly in my career. So what we're going to talk about in the agenda is first we're going to just refresh ourselves on what the current overtime rules are so that we can better understand what and how they're changing and what we need to do to address that. So it's going to be a little bit of a refresher there, but I think it's important to set the stage. We'll then talk about what the new overtime rules are, what the pros and cons of those rules are, and when and if they're going to go into effect. And I say if because they are still being challenged in a lot of different forums, including in Congress, in courts, in lobbying groups. There's a chance, albeit quite slim at this juncture, that the rules will be either delayed or completely overruled. I don't think that's going to happen before they go into effect on December 1st, so we need to prepare for this. But we will talk about what some of those developments are and what I predict will be the ultimate outcome of all that. We're also going to talk about a couple of overtime myths. I have spent over 20 years, as Roxanne said, doing this, and I've collected a list of things that I call common myths that seem to create a lot of misunderstanding in this particular area. And then we'll talk about a couple of unique overtime issues that tend to arise quite frequently in workplaces. I am based in Massachusetts. I do law around, practice law around the country. This is a federal law, so it applies to all of you. And I'm going to take the position, I'm assuming there's people on this phone call that are on this webinar that are from around the country. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well because you also have your state law overtime issues to contend with at the same time. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what is the overtime rules? It's very basic. You all know this. If you're classified as non-exempt, meaning you're not exempt from overtime, for any hours worked over 40 in a given week, you get time and a half your regular rate. So if your rate of pay is $40 an hour and you work 41 hours in a week and you're non-exempt, that 41st hour you are paid at $60 an hour for that hour instead of $40 an hour. That's the basic. Everyone knows that. If you're, but how are you exempt or non-exempt? And that's what the rules are really targeting. There's two things you have to accomplish or satisfy in order to be exempt from overtime. First, you must be paid a minimum salary of $455 per week. That's base salary. You don't count any other sorts of compensation like bonuses or commissions, attendance bonuses or things like that. It's $455 a week in base salary. So if you're the CEO of a company and I've actually litigated a case like this, and you're only earning $300 a week, you are entitled to overtime, period, no questions. You must make $4.55. That is the primary piece of the overtime rules that are being changed by this new legislation, these new rules that go into effect in December. Must be paid on a salary basis, which basically means you can't make deductions from someone's salary if they're out of work. For example, if someone is sick for an afternoon, you don't dock their pay for 3 or 4 hours, because then that would essentially make them an hourly employee. And then finally, you need to satisfy one or more of what's called the white-collar exemptions, or the highly compensated employee exemption. There's a lot of confusion around the exemptions. There's a lot of litigation surrounding them. They're not very clear. They provide some guideposts, but they don't give a lot of guidance. I typically say there's 20% of positions on one end that are clearly exempt. There's another 20% on the other end that are clearly non-exempt, and then there's that big mass in the middle of 60% that it's hard to tell. This presentation is not going to address those white-collar exemptions. They're very detailed, they're very complicated, and they're not being changed by the upcoming new rules. So, you know, we will reference them because it's important to know that they're out there, but we're really not going to get into what each of the white-collar exemptions does or says. But let's talk about salary basis. So again, those are the 3 requirements: $4.55, salary basis, white-collar exemption. So salary basis, again, pretty simple. It basically means you must receive the same amount of money every week, regardless of the quantity or quality of your work. So again, if I decide, if I'm only in 30 hours this week because I've got some personal things I'm attending to, or I was stuck in traffic, it happens in Boston all the time, then my pay doesn't change. If I only put in 32 hours, I still get paid my full base salary. If I put in 50 hours, I get paid by same base salary. That's the quid pro quo of being exempt. You get a lot of flexibility in your schedule, but you don't get overtime. If done correctly, if not done correctly, if you start deducting the pay from exempt employees, you can end up losing the exemption and creating liability for unpaid overtime. And we're going to talk about that. So what does that mean? It means that anytime you find yourself docking the pay or paying a salaried salaried exempt employee anything less than their base salary for that week, a red flag should be going up saying, wait a minute, this should be the exception rather than the rule. There's only 3 or 4 circumstances where this is legally permissible. So let's make sure we look at this and get it right, because again, if you get it wrong, you could end up rendering the person non-exempt. So what are those deductions that are permissible and that don't jeopardize the exemption? The first and last weeks of work, that's easy. If somebody starts work on a Wednesday, you don't have to pay them for the full week. You don't pay them for Monday and Tuesday before they were hired. So in that particular week, you would pay them for 3/5 of their base salary. Same concept on the tail end of work. If somebody resigns on the Thursday, they only get paid 4/5 of their salary that week instead of the full salary. If an employee takes an absence for a full day, and full days is underlined for a reason, you really need to focus on those words, full days, for personal reasons, you can deduct the pay for that. So full days. So an employee comes to you and says, I need to leave early. I need to leave at 2 o'clock today to beat the traffic because I'm leaving to go to a wedding this weekend. So I'm going to leave at 2 instead of 5. That's 3 hours. You can't, that's a personal reason, but you can't dock the pay for that because it's not a full day. If, however, the employee came in and said, on Thursday, I'm going to take the whole day off tomorrow because I need to leave for a wedding, then in that case, you don't have to, but you could dock up that Friday, that full day, the person's pay. Same thing if someone's sick. The way to look at this is if the person is ready, able, and willing to work, then you must pay them. If they're not able to work for their own reason, for their own personal reason, you don't have to pay them. Again, full days only. Unpaid disciplinary suspensions of 1 or more full days imposed in good faith for violations of written workplace conduct rules. I would tell you I would use that one sparingly. There's lots of conditions imposed on this. You'd have to establish that it's actually a violation of a written policy that has been uniformly enforced. It's there if you absolutely need it, but I would hesitate to use that one frequently. And then the last one, and this is the only situation where you're allowed to do a partial day increment. For those on the phone who deal a lot with HR and benefits and are familiar with the FMLA, as you know, under the Family Medical Leave Act, you can give people intermittent leave. So the leave does not need to be taken in big blocks. For example, if somebody needs dialysis treatment every Friday afternoon, they can set it up so that every Friday afternoon they take 4 hours of FMLA leave, and that 4 hours gets deducted from their FMLA leave bank. In that certain circumstance only, you do not have to pay the employee for those 4 hours, even though it's a partial day, but it's got to be directly tied to FMLA leave. I will tell you, most of my clients pay, they find it too administratively cumbersome to try to figure out. It costs them more to not pay the person than to pay the person, put it that way, particularly if you're a larger organization and have several people on leave. So a lot of times, clients use these deductions for other reasons rather than to save money necessarily. So what are the white-collar exemptions? Again, I'm not going to get into the details of what each one of them is, but these are the exemptions. And so long as you can satisfy one of these 6, and you have a salary basis of $455, again, you're going to be exempt under the current rules. Executive, administrative, learned professionals, creative professionals, outside sales employees, and computer employees. Let's talk just quickly about a couple of these. First of all, keep in mind that these are legal terms of art, so they have very specific legal meaning. So don't ascribe the common meaning to these terms, because I think that can throw a lot of people off. When it says executive, it doesn't mean C-level people or VPs or above. It basically means managerial in this context. If one supervises 2 or more people and then satisfies a couple of other requirements, then that person would satisfy the executive exemption, even if they're only a team lead or an assistant manager or something like that. Same thing with administrative. It doesn't necessarily apply just to administrative employees. It basically means anything other than managerial. So administrative functions are human resources, finance, marketing, et cetera. Learned professionals is a pretty narrow one, doesn't come up a lot in most companies. It's really for folks that have to have high-level degrees, lawyers, doctors, accountants. Teachers actually fall into that category. So that one's pretty more black and white than some of the other ones. Creative professionals are your writers and filmmakers and musicians and things of that nature. There's an obvious reason for that. It's hard to put a price tag. You can't. Well, might take one 10 hours to write a song or 30 hours to write a song. So if you're paying them, if you're giving them overtime, it could really break the bank, so to speak. Outside sales employees. This is an interesting one and one you should really think about. The FLSA makes a very clear distinction between outside sales employees and inside sales employees. Outside sales employees are exempt, period. Inside sales employees are not exempt, period. The question is what's the distinction between the two? And I will just tell you that this one is treated incorrectly by more often than not. I have many clients who do not do this properly and knowingly, and they're willing to take the risk, but I think it's a pretty big risk. Outside sales employees means you perform your sales functions outside of the normal premises of the employee. So it's the traditional traveling salesperson. You go to the client site, you pitch the wares. Comes up a lot in the pharma industry, where the pharma reps will go to the doctor's office and try to sell them certain drugs. That's outside sales. A lot of sales now, though, with the internet and electronic communications is done inside. Inside means you basically sell on the phone or on the internet. So if you're selling software and you never go to the client site and you're just selling it from your desktop, essentially, you are an inside sales employee and you are not exempt from overtime. At least under that particular exemption. You might satisfy one of the other ones, and many times that's the case. One person could fall in 3 or 4 of these. But you really want to make sure you take a look at your inside versus outside and make sure you're getting that correct. Finally, there's a computer employee. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's really a separate animal. It's one of the few that you don't have to pay a salary basis. Computer employees can be paid by the hour and still be exempt from overtime, but they have to be make a certain amount an hour, and I think it's $27 and some odd cents. and there's some other requirements. But keep in mind, and it's not just every computer employee or any computer employee. We're talking here about your high-end systems architecture folks, your systems integrators. This is not, help desk. This is not network administration. This is not database administration. It's really the guys that are architecting the entire back-end backbone of the system. So again, you want to make sure you don't overuse that particular exemption. Okay, again, just a little more time on this because it is important. Obviously, every employee has a series of duties. Some duties are more important than others. If you break it down duty by duty, some duties are exempt, some duties are non-exempt. So what you look at is what the employee's primary duty is, and it's going to be to customarily and regularly. And those are terms that are defined in the statute itself. Primary duty, and they don't make it easy, is the principal or most important duty. Note, it has absolutely nothing to do with quantity. One could spend more than 50% of their time on a duty and have it not be the primary duty. And let me give you a prime example. I do a lot of work with Dunkin' Donuts and the Dunkin' Donuts franchises. Most assistant managers, at least assistant managers at Dunkin' Donuts or managers, are exempt. They satisfy the executive exemption. They don't make that much money. But if your Dunkin' Donuts is anything like mine, whenever I'm in there and it's busy, the manager is waiting on customers, the manager is filling the cooler, he's making coffee, in addition to managing. Many managers will spend more than half their shift doing that, but their primary duty is still managing that particular organization. So that, for purposes of the FLSA, they are exempt. Customarily and regularly, it means, again, more than occasional but less than constant. Again, those are just words, but it does try to provide a little bit of guidance. If it's something you sort of do day in and day out, it's obviously customarily and regularly. If there's as an example, a meeting you have to go to once a month and you have to present at, probably not customarily and regularly. And then there's, again, the vast majority in between of who knows. I get a question a lot about job descriptions. Should we have job descriptions? Are they important? I think they're important so long as they're accurate. Because regardless of what the job description says, for purposes of the Fair Labor Standards Act, auditors or the courts will look at what the person actually does. So you want them to be accurate. They are helpful when it comes to litigation under this stuff. But again, at the end of the day, they are somewhat irrelevant if they don't accurately reflect the day-to-day duties. Okay, there's one other quick exemption we'll talk about, and then we're going to get into the new overtime regulations. This one is a fairly new one. As most of you know, this law was passed, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in the 30s. It's been around for a long time. And it was passed as a way to combat the sweatshops and child labor issues and things like that, and the exploitation of labor that was occurring in the 20s and 30s around the Great Depression. In 2000, so this an executive, administrative, professional, all that stuff has been around for almost 100 years. The highly compensated employee exemption was created in 2004, and I will say I think it's rarely used, but it's something that you can always hopefully point to if you're in a sticky situation. So what does this one say? If you receive total annual compensation of at least $100,000. That's the first factor you have to satisfy. Now, keep in mind, when we talk about the overtime rules, the salary, what makes up the base salary, I'm going to go back to slide 3 for a minute. The number you look at is $455 per week in base salary, no other forms of compensation. When we're looking at the highly compensated exemption, highly compensated employee exemption, you do count those other things. You can count commissions. You can count bonuses only if they're non-discretionary. So you could cobble all of those together, and if they make up $100,000 and you satisfy the rest of these requirements, you could satisfy this exemption. Now, some people say, well, how do you necessarily know what a person's going to make at the end of the year? And that's a very good question. There is a grace period at the end of the calendar year by which you can do a true-up. So if on December 31st you look back and you find out that this person only received $97,000, you could give them an extra $3,000 within, I think it's within the first 30 days of the next calendar year to true that up and then satisfy the exemption. You also have to perform office or non-manual work. So that's also a requirement. and you must perform one or more of the exempt duties of any of the executive, administrative, or professional employees. Now, again, we didn't go through all the requirements for each of those exemptions, but each one requires 3 or 4 factors to be satisfied, all of them. For example, executive says you must supervise at least 2 people, and you must have the ability to or have a substantial influence in the hiring and firing of people. Those are 2 separate requirements. If you don't satisfy both, you're not exempt under the executive exemption. If you can meet one of those, though, if, for example, you supervise 2 people but you have no input in hiring and firing and you make $100,000, you can take advantage of the HCE exemption, if that makes sense. So it does give you an option for certain employees. I will tell you that most people who are making that amount of money usually are exempt under other exemptions, but again, it's there and you should know about it. Okay, so that brings us to sort of the status quo. What's the law today? Where are we going in 2 months? Actually less than 2 months at this point. Basically, there's 3 changes. As I said before, no one's touching the duties. The duties are what they are. Courts and employers are going to continue to fight over what's exempt, what's non-exempt, which white-collar exemption applies. But this is focusing on the salary basis piece. It's increasing that $455 number that we talked about. That's going up to $970 a month, a week. I'm sorry, $913 a week. They are making some changes to the highly compensated employee exemption that we just spoke about. And one of the most controversial changes is that they're going to index and update the salary basis level every 3 years now. That $455 number hasn't changed in probably at least 10 years, probably longer. And it's taken the Department of Labor almost 2 years to go through the rulemaking process to get the new change into effect. There's a very specific process one must go through. Actually, let me take a step back for the moment and explain where these regulations are coming from, because I think this helps people better understand what the ramifications are. These new overtime regulations are not laws. They are not laws that were passed by Congress. They are regulations that were put into effect by the Department of Labor, which is a branch of the executive. So it's nothing to do with Congress authorizes the Department of Labor to create these regulations, and there's some very rigorous protocols that the Department of Labor has to go through to get the regulations passed. But again, they don't have the force of law. So Congress can come in at any time and say, we are going to overrule that regulation. And unless the president vetoes that, that law would go into effect. So again, one of the biggest, going back to this, what the changes are, the indexing and automatic increases has caused a lot of uproar. People are saying, no, that's not fair. Congress or the Department of Labor should have to go through the process and determine what the best number is at that time, rather than have automatic increases every 3 years indexed to some, index like the Consumer Price Index. So we'll talk about each one of these in a little more detail right now. Again, these go into effect on December 1, 2016, unless they get delayed or overruled. Again, I think the odds of that are slim, so we do need to get moving and prepare for this. So again, we're going from $455 a week to $913 a week. It's almost a twofold increase, creating a lot of issues for small businesses who have low margins as it is. But that's what the regulation says. So starting on December 1st, if you have anybody who is making less than $913 a week and you have them classified as exempt, you need to relook at that and decide what you want to do. But they're doing another little change too. As I said before, the $455 a week currently, you can only use base salary to satisfy that threshold. Under the new rule, the 913, you can include up to 10% of non-discretionary bonuses and commissions to make up that $913. So 91 of those dollars of the 913 can be comprised of commissions or non-discretionary bonuses, provided that those commissions or bonuses are paid at least quarterly. So there's a process for, again, truing up once a quarter to see how much the person has made. I want to focus on the word non-discretionary. That is important. Most bonuses, at least of the clients I deal with, are discretionary. What's the difference? It's pretty simple. Discretionary means even if you've satisfied all the factors that we said you had to satisfy, you hit all the metrics, you had all your targets, we reserve the right to not pay any bonuses or pay some bonuses. That's truly discretionary. A non-discretionary bonus is, if you hit these metrics, we will pay you X. It's a given. So you need to make sure you understand what the difference between those if you're going to apply that new rule. On January 1, 2020, which is 3 years after the rule goes into effect, and every 3 years thereafter, the threshold will be reset. So that $913 is going to go, I mean, I guess it could go down in theory, but it's more likely to go up. And what they're going to take is the lowest wage census region in the country, which currently is the Southeast. They'll look at the average weekly wage in that particular area of the country and set the number at 40% of that. So that's just some boring detail on how they're actually going to come up with the number. So that's what's happening with the salary threshold. And that's obviously the biggest controversy, because it's got real economic impact to businesses, particularly small businesses, nonprofits, and the like. The highly compensated employee exemption, they're changing the threshold from 100 to 134,000. So that's going up significantly, which I think there'll be even less people taking advantage of this particular exemption. Again, every 3 years thereafter, that too will be indexed and it'll change. Now here they're using a different number. They're using the earnings of workers nationally, not in the Southeast, and they're setting it at the 90th percentile of weekly earnings rather than the 40th percentile. So that's how that's going to be treated. So why are we having these changes? What's broken that we're trying to fix? Depends on who you talk to or who you ask. The Obama administration and the Democrats, and I'm not trying to politicize this, but I'm just sort of trying to state things factually. Based on these new rules, the estimate is that about close to 5 million people actually will now become eligible for overtime. The idea is that will spur additional hiring, where employers will not want to pay the overtime premiums, so rather than having someone work 80 hours a week, they'll hire 2 people, each to work 40 hours a week, and that's just good for the economy. Since Congress has not been able to pass an increase in the minimum wage, this is a way to effectively give people more wages without having to do it through Congress. I've heard a lot of expressions about reinvigorating the middle class, and then also making workplaces more family-friendly by reducing the amount of overtime some people have to work. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is different, and there's a lot of concerns that have been expressed. First, that it doesn't adequately reflect regional differences in wages. $913 in Biloxi, Mississippi will go a lot farther than $913 in Manhattan. Personally, I think that the regulators are discounting the fact that many employees want to be exempt. They don't want to be non-exempt. I think some people still feel that there's a stigma attached to being non-exempt. You're blue collar, you're a clock puncher, whatever the words are. You do lose some flexibility. A lot of people like the idea of sneaking out to go see a son's baseball game or a daughter's game, a soccer game, something like that, for a couple of hours without having to worry about tracking their time and docking their pay. And a lot of people have said that they will see this as a demotion. That this is, I worked in the non-exempt ranks, I finally got promoted, I'm exempt, and now I'm going back to where I was. And a lot of people find that this will not play well with a lot of folks. It can lead to litigation of past practices. This is, to me, the biggest issue with these new regulations. As a defense lawyer and one who tries to keep his clients out of court, I don't care how good of an employer you are, how robust your compliance programs are, it is impossible to comply 100% with every aspect of the Fair Labor Standards Act. I can guarantee that every one of you has some violation out there, hopefully smaller rather than larger, but they're there. What's going to happen is, if one of these people who I mentioned who doesn't like the idea that they're being demoted gets the letter from their employer saying, as of this date, you're now going to be non-exempt, you're going to have to track your time, punch a clock, here's your new wage rate, et cetera, they might go to a lawyer and say, this is wrong, they can't do this. Can they do this? And the lawyer's going to say, yeah, well, these new regulations out, they can't do it. But it's a little curious because I think you've been non-exempt all along. I think they've had you misclassified as exempt up until this point. So I think we should sue them for the last 3 years of back wages. I think there's a real danger that that's going to happen a lot. So that's another issue. That issue, of course, doesn't really play well with Congress if you try to raise that as an offense. But that's an issue I've heard many employers and employer representatives refer to. Most businesses are saying they are going to cut headcount because of this, because it's just going to be too expensive. So it won't lead to the increase of jobs. It'll be just the opposite, and it'll lead to a decrease in jobs. The other thing is they're going to have a whole group of managers now who, in theory, have never managed non-exempt people, and now are going to have all their teams be non-exempt, and they're going to have to learn about timekeeping, what they can or can't do when it comes to the timekeeping, how they address that. I'm in the middle of a case right now that in California where the managers were going in, and not because they were trying to be mean or nefarious, they just didn't know better, and changing people's time on their timesheets and reducing the amount of hours. We have a big problem in that particular case. And again, the managers didn't know better, so you could say shame on them, but no one told them. So those are some of the concerns with these new regulations. I'm looking at an article right now where some small employers were interviewed about these new regulations, and most of them said they're going to have to make cuts somewhere else. Okay, so we're going to have to make more money available for overtime. So where's that going to come from? It's going to come out of, we're going to increase our health insurance premiums. We're going to cut life insurance benefits. We're going to decrease or eliminate bonuses. So it's not like there's not a dollar for dollar corresponding impact for every dollar in overtime that is made. So that's just some of the policy and philosophical reasons behind these. So I mentioned earlier, I said when or if these go into effect. As I said, currently they're scheduled to go into effect on December 1st, which is by design, frankly, a date between the election and Inauguration Day. And I think, again, that is by design. The Republicans are trying to use something called the Congressional Review Act, which is a arcane process that can be used to invalidate regulations. That is subject to presidential veto, so to the extent that even gets to Obama's desk, odds of that getting passed are pretty low. The Chamber of Commerce has sued the Department of Labor over the automatic increases, saying the Department of Labor does not have the authority to do that, even under the congressional authority that was given to them, that exceeded that authority, and they weren't allowed to do automatic increases. That case was filed in Texas, perhaps not surprisingly. It's one of the more conservative federal courts in the country. 21 states have sued the Department of Labor, arguing that the new rule improperly focuses on salary and not on duties. Because keep in mind, these states are going to have to start paying, these states are subject, state employees are subject to these rules as well. So states are going to have to start paying their employees more money, and that's one of their arguments is you are basically unconstitutionally taking our money. Probably no surprise the 21 states that have signed on to this, mostly red states or states with Republican governors. Just quickly, Louisiana, Maine, Kentucky, Kansas, Iowa, Indiana, Georgia, et cetera. Most people don't think those lawsuits, that lawsuit, by the way, also was filed in Texas. Most observers don't think either one of those lawsuits have any much of a chance of, while they may delay things a little bit, they don't think they're going to actually win the case. It's a lot of noise, but most people think it's really not going to change the path that we're currently on. In late September, a bipartisan bill was introduced, or was actually passed in the House, that would phase in the rule over 3 years and eliminate automatic increases. Believe it or not, some Republicans have still objected to that, saying it's all or nothing, that they don't want any rule whatsoever, and they're not willing to live with a watered down rule. But that has passed the House. To my knowledge, a similar bill has not yet passed the Senate. And even if they did and they could come up with a compromise bill, it's subject to veto, and most people believe that Obama will veto this. So that leads to presidential elections. While Trump, to my knowledge, has not come out and given us a platform on this particular issue, Most observers think that if Republicans do take the White House, this rule will be withdrawn or watered down by the administration, because again, they have the authority to do that. The president can come in and tell the Department of Labor, which he is responsible for, he or she, and say, I don't want you to enforce this rule, I want you to revoke this rule, whatever it might be, so the rule essentially becomes a dead letter. So any one of those things could happen. But again, I think we would be foolhardy to not prepare and not expect to be ready on December 1st. So what can you do now? It's really pretty simple. And you have one of two choices. You can either raise, if you have someone that falls into that category, that person that currently makes less than $913 a week, even if you factor in that 10% of commissions or bonuses, so they make less than $913, which equates to about $47,000 and change annually. You can either increase their base salaries to meet that level so that they remain exempt, and there's a cost to that obviously, or you keep them at their current salary level and you start paying them overtime, or some combination thereof. You obviously don't have to do it en masse one way or the other. You can do it one way with some group of employees, a different way with other groups of employees. It doesn't really matter. But either way, there's obviously an economic impact to it. Just as an example, Walmart came out this week and has said, even though the law hasn't changed yet, they've elected to go with the increasing the salaries. So most of their managers make about $40,000 a year, according to this article, and they're just going to raise everybody's salary up to the $47,500 to meet that threshold. So that's how Walmart is addressing it. I have some other clients who are saying, you know what, we're going to bite the bullet. They're going to become non-exempt, and we'll pay them overtime as they work it. As you're going through this, you should also think about whether there are other exemptions that could apply. Some of the exemptions, white-collar exemptions, don't apply the salary test at all. For example, learned professionals. I know it doesn't come up that much, but a lawyer, for example, you don't have to worry about paying a lawyer $913 a week. But those are really your two options. So, how you actually mechanically do that is another question, but, getting a spreadsheet, at least getting the information in front of you now and starting to look at, if you haven't already, what how many people you have in that group, how much they make, and what some high-level cost impacts are. You should be doing that now. No question. So that's the end of the section on sort of the new rules. As I said, there's been a lot of ink spilled, but not much is actually changing at the end of the day. It has huge impacts, but in terms of the mechanics of it, it's very simple. 455 to 913, you can apply 10% of other income to make up that 913, and the number is going to change every 3 years. That's effectively the extent of the changes. Okay, as I said earlier, there were some and while I had everyone on the phone, it's a good opportunity to go through and dispel some of these overtime myths that I've collected over the years. One is that I hear this all the time. Oh, he's on a salary, so he's exempt. I said, well, and that's coming from a lot of times experienced business people, experienced HR people. Well, as we now know after going through this presentation, that's one part of the equation. You still have to satisfy the duties test. So the mere fact that someone's paid on a salary does not necessarily mean they're not eligible for overtime. This one I heard at a webinar I gave a few months ago, and I've heard it several times since. I advise clients, I don't think it's a bad idea to make everybody track their time and keep track of the hours they're working. For a couple of reasons. One is partly I'm a lawyer, so I've spent my career tracking my time, so I don't think it's a big deal to actually do. But putting that aside, keeping track of the hours people are working or what they're working on can help managers, better align their staff, better level the workloads among their staff, can see where there's areas that they might need to hire more help, things like that. The second issue, though, is think about it. If someone doesn't track their time, you have them classified as exempt, they don't track their time, and then they bring a lawsuit and say, you know what, I was misclassified. I should have been classified as non-exempt, so I'm entitled to all this overtime. Well, the question becomes, okay, even if that's so, how much do we owe you? How much overtime did you work? Nobody tracked the hours. What the law says is that whatever the employee says he or she worked is presumptively true until and unless the employer can prove otherwise. So it shifts the burden of proof effectively to the employer to disprove the amount of hours the employee is stating. And I literally had a case where the employee said, I worked 100 hours a week. Now, possible every now and then, perhaps, consistently, not a chance, and we had to figure out other ways to fight that. But the point is that we had someone keeping their hours, even if they were classified as exempt, we would at least have a record of what we might owe them, and it certainly wouldn't be 100 hours a week. So when I raised that at the last webinar, somebody said, I thought it was illegal to make salary people record their hours. And the answer is absolutely not. You can make anybody you want record their hours, nothing improper or illegal about it. They may not like it, but it's not improper. The other thing I hear is, okay, so we're exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act, so I guess we're all set, we can't be liable. Well, not so fast. There are state overtime laws. Most states have them. At least half the states basically follow the FLSA. So in those states, if you're compliant with the FLSA, you're automatically compliant with state law. Some states still have some very different requirements and some additional requirements. And so you need to be very aware of that. If there's any folks in the audience in California or Colorado, for example, California has a daily overtime rate. Now remember, the FLSA, it's if you work more than 40 hours in a week, you're entitled to overtime. In California, if you work more than 8 hours in a day, you're entitled to overtime, even if that's the only day you work that week. Let's assume you take vacation Monday through Friday, you don't work at all, you work 10 hours on vacation Monday through Thursday, you work 10 hours on Friday. In California, you would get 2 hours of overtime. Same thing for Colorado. It's 1.5 pay if you work more than 12 hours in a single day, again, regardless of how many hours you worked in that particular week. So the point being is you always want to make sure you look at what your state law is as well when making some of these determinations. One last slide, then we'll go on to questions. This is questions that I get all the time. They don't necessarily relate to these new rules, but they're questions I get all the time, so I think it's important to spend a couple minutes just talking about them. One is additional compensation. This comes up a lot. What if I want to give, I have an employee, they're exempt, they're paid a salary, we have no question that their duties are exempt, but I want to give them some special extra pay. And that pay is going to be based on how many hours they work. If I do that, am I now losing the exemption? Am I basically rendering them non-exempt? And the answer is no. You can actually provide additional compensation even on an hourly basis and still maintain the overtime exemption so long as they're making the $9.13 a week. And I won't read the example, but there's an example in the on the slide that actually comes from a real case I worked on, which I think really illustrates that point. Another one I get is, well, we'll just give the person comp time instead of paying them overtime. What does that mean? It means, oh, you work 5 hours of overtime. We're not going to pay you OT, but, we'll give you 5 extra days of vacation, or you can leave early on Friday. That is, even with the employee's consent, that is illegal. Some states allow that for public employees. I just want to point that out. But under the Fair Labor Standards Act, that is not permissible. Again, even with the employee's consent. So comp time is not the silver bullet answer. Finally, a lot of clients sort of, it's funny, during the Great Depression, the Great Recession, I wasn't alive during the Great Depression, companies were really looking at ways to cut costs everywhere they could, from 2008, 9, 10, those bad years. And I had a number of clients when I started looking at this stuff, and I'm realizing they were paying people overtime if they were compensated for 40 hours in a week rather than worked 40 hours in a week. They just misunderstood the rule. What's that mean? It means if someone takes vacation Monday through Friday, they are comped. They take vacation. They get 8 hours of vacation for each day. They get paid, and then they work on 10 hours on Friday. These clients were paying 2 hours of overtime because the person, in their view, had worked 42 hours that week. That's not the case. You only have to comp people with overtime if they've actually worked 40 hours in a week, not if they've been paid or compensated for 40 hours in a week. So just something to point out, because once a couple of clients realized that, they were able to actually make some pretty significant savings that went right to the bottom line. So that's the end of the formal presentation. Oops, sorry, I scrolled one too many here. So I'll turn it over now to Roxanne and any questions that folks might have.
Thank you, Stephen. And Thank you for listening. We now will open up the floor for questions, but first I'd like to mention that the HRCI activity ID is on the final slide, and you will need that to submit for your HRCI credit. So Stephen, if you could leave that final slide up, that'd be great. Thanks. Okay, let's see what questions are out there. I have a question. If an employee is currently exempt from the overtime rules due to being classified as an executive employee or professional employee, how does the new salary threshold impact them?
How does the new salary threshold?
Yes, how does the new salary threshold impact them?
So if they are exempt under those two, and I'll assume that they're properly classified as that they meet the duties of executive or professional. If they're already getting paid more than $913 a week in base salary, then nothing changes for those folks. And if they do meet the executive, and if they are truly an executive or professional, they probably make more than that as it is. So yeah, for those folks, that's the only thing you need to look at is what their pay is, and if it's more than $913, don't need to worry about those folks at all.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Another question we have is, what if the employee has exhausted all of their FMLA and they're still in need of partial days off for medical reasons? Can the employer still deduct for partial days?
No. You'd have to only do it in full days at that point. And that's the slide about, I think, sickness. Hold on, I'm going to go to it right now. Absences for full days of sickness. That's the third bullet on slide 5. So it covers that. So again, no, you could not do partial day there. You'd have to still do full days.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Okay, another question is, these new rules, which the DOL estimates will entitle the approximately 4.2 million additional American workers to overtime, is scheduled to go into effect on December 1st, 2016. So this person is a caller, and they were on a call that just said the blurb or something like that was forwarded and was pushed to the June 1st, 2017. Can you speak on the two dates?
I have not heard about the June 1st, 2017. That might be, and I do read every day something called the Daily Labor Report, which is about as exciting as it sounds, but it gives you a compendium of everything that happened the prior day in this area. Hold on one second. That might be the bill. I think what that's referring to is the House bill that was passed that would delay implementation until next summer, but that does not have the force of law yet.
Okay.
I'm 99% sure that's the case.
And the caller, if you're listening still, if that didn't answer your question, please submit any additional clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I just checked my notes. The bill that was passed on September 29th by the House would push back the rule until June of 2017. That is not cleared the Senate yet, nor has it hit the President's desk.
Okay, so we're still going ahead with the 12/1/2016 effective date, correct, Stephen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another attendee has asked, how do we reduce the chance of being charged for back pay of overtime for those misclassified employees? Can we call it reclassified to reduce risk?
I think the question gets at how you go about changing someone from one status to another and mitigating your risk. And there's not an easy answer. I do this a lot. Sometimes we'll do routine audits or internal audits to see if classifications are done correctly, and we'll spot some things that say, you know, this person really should be non-exempt. And you run a risk of reclassifying them because the response is always, well, that means, you know, don't you owe me some money then? And there's ways you can sort of message that and try to mitigate that, but it's really a case-by-case basis. For example, we will sometimes say, we're giving a fresh look. We still think we've been okay, but I've had a situation where the company was getting itself in position to be bought. And they said, we don't want the acquirer, potential acquirer, to look at this and think there's an issue, so we're just trying to make sure everything looks okay. Anything you can do to sort of message it so that the employee does not think that they've been being improperly classified to date, but that's the risk you run when you reclassify. So some people prefer to just hold their breath, start classifying new employees correctly, and then leave the current employee base where it's at, with the idea that after time that'll, with turnover, there'll be less and less folks that have that exposure. But it's a very delicate situation every time you do it.
Okay, thank you. Another question is asking whether this ruling affects agricultural workers.
I'm going to punt on that one. There's a whole separate set of rules for agricultural workers. I frankly have never looked at them. I don't represent any agricultural entities, so I apologize. I just can't answer that one.
Okay, fair enough. And then we have another attendee saying that they currently pay their employees every 2 weeks. Will our pay periods need to switch to every week?
No. The payroll frequency is governed by state law rather than the federal law. So the Fair Labor Standards Act says nothing about when someone is to be paid. It just says what they're to be paid. And it leaves it to the states to determine when those wages are to be paid. So so long as your state permits biweekly payroll, and some states don't for non-exempt employees, just FYI. So long as they permit that, then you're fine. This would not impact that one way or the other.
Okay, good to know.
But let me just take it one step further. When you're looking at that 2-week snapshot, though, when you're applying or determining whether overtime is owed, you look at each week on an individual basis. On week 1, was there any overtime owed? Yes or no. On week 2, and then you aggregate that and put it into the biweekly paycheck.
Okay, that leads into another question. What would you recommend as the best method for determining how to comply for the new December 1st deadline, trying to determine whether or not they should be paid overtime or not?
Yeah, again, I think you want to get a printout from hopefully you have an HRIS or some sort of system that you use to track your employees, and literally do a sort of everybody you have sort it so you have everybody that's classified as exempt, and look at their salary ranges, break down their salaries down to a weekly basis, and see if you have anybody falling below that number, and you focus on that group. That's the quickest and easiest thing. And then each one of those people that fall into that group, you need to look at on a case-by-case basis, maybe talk to their managers, and figure out what you're going to do with that particular person.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Let's see. The next question up is, if employers are in compliance if they follow the annualized amount, does that make them in compliance, or do they have to make sure they are always in compliance each week?
Each week. It's a weekly snapshot. So people, I won't pull a pun on that. People always equate it to an annual. They say, oh, 913 equals $47,700 a week, or a year. If you didn't pay anybody all year and you only paid them $47,700 on December 31st, you would be in violation, because you need to look at, again, every single week on a week-by-week snapshot.
Okay, thank you. Next up, what is a learned professional such as a CPA if they're working hours based on a project? How are they still exempt from the salary basis test?
I'm can you, I couldn't hear quite well the last couple lines, Roxanne.
Okay, I'm sorry. They're asking, what if it's someone like a learned professional, a CPA, and they're working hours based on a project rather than salary?
Yes, sorry, yeah, as I indicated earlier, some of these exemptions, and the learned professional is one of them, the computer employee is another one, don't require the salary basis test. It is required for the administrative and executive functions, which encompass 75% of all exemptions. It's not required by the learned professionals. So learned professionals can be paid on a piece rate, piece rate, project-based, fixed fee basis, anything like that. And again, so long as that equates to $913 a week, when you do the math, and it usually, if you're at that level, it most likely will. You're going to be all set.
Okay. This one, they're wanting to verify that any person employed as an outside salesperson does not need to have their salary increased.
That is true. The salary basis does not apply to outside sales. That's why you can have a commission-only salesperson, for example. so you don't need to worry about the salary basis test. I'm not sure. You probably should. I think it's always a good idea to make sure the person is at least making minimum wage, which is a separate issue. But most sales functions at least provide for a minimum draw, at least most of the ones I've been familiar with, that the person is at least taking, or they have a healthy, they have a base salary, albeit maybe small, in addition to the commissions, which would cover the minimum wage. But you're right. This would not change, in theory, your outside sales employees' salaries.
Okay. This is a good question. Regarding comp time, is it correct that it is illegal? For example, if an employee works a half hour extra on a Tuesday, they could not legally come in a half hour late on a Wednesday.
Legally, again, there's some state laws for certain types of employees. I think state employees or municipal employees that might be permissible. It also might be permissible under a collective bargaining agreement if you have unions. Putting those aside, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, it is absolutely not permissible. Now, as a practical matter, if you agree with that and the employee agrees with that, is it ever going to become an issue? Probably not. But if it did, and the employee wanted to, let's say that employee gets fired the next day and is not happy, shall we say, they can go back and say, hey, I didn't get my overtime yesterday. I don't care what I agreed to. And he's right, the agreement is invalid. So you would have to pay that half an hour of overtime in this scenario. But again, practically speaking, the way that it was laid out, it's probably not going to happen. But there is no defense to say it was, he made it up. It just that there is no comp time defense under the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Okay. This follows that one regarding comp time on non-exempt. Is it okay to allow employees to comp their holiday pay? This would still put their actual worked hours as under 40 hours, for example. If they comp an 8-hour holiday, is it allowable to require them to work 8 hours to be at 40?
I have to be honest, Royce, I'm not sure what that question's asking. Let's put that one aside and follow up in writing on that one.
Okay.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
It was a little bit confusing, so maybe we can get some clarity from the person that asked. What about for exempt employees? Can they comp their hours worked and use them for time off at a later time? And I think you addressed that partly in the previous question.
Yeah, if they're exempt, you can do, there's really no comp time per se because they can take whatever time off they want, right? They could work 1 hour a week and still get paid. What typically happens is, on the exempt side, as a practical matter, you just give people more vacation time. You've been working day and night getting this project done for the last month. We'll give you another extra week of vacation. But it's not comp time per se, since there's no pay docking going on and there's no overtime issues.
Okay. Can you repeat the myth about keeping time cards for exempt employees? Is it do or don't?
Say that again. Is it do what? Is it?
I guess they're asking, should they keep time cards for exempt employees or should they not? Because they were asking about the myth about keeping.
Yeah. Again, my recommendation is to always have people do it. I think there's good legal reasons to do it. There's good business reasons to do it. And I don't think at the end of the day it really causes a lot of pain. Again, I realize I'm a lawyer, so I track my time in 6-minute increments, and I've done that for 25 years, so I have a very different view on that. Again, I think, if it's a large, and some people don't say you have to. If you work for a federal contractor or a government contractor, oftentimes you have to keep track of your time. So other situations as well, but it just has so many, I think, beneficial aspects to it. Aside from there's the culture piece, and I don't want to undervalue that. But if it's really going to cause an uproar and people are just going to be, it's going to create this distraction, then maybe you don't do it, or you pick certain groups, or certain groups that you think are risky in terms of your classification, make them record their time. And you're not going to have your C-level executives record their time, nor do we need to, because they're never going to challenge your exemption. So you could limit it to certain groups that are sort of in the gray zone, so to speak.
Okay. Another one, this one's interesting. How do these rules apply to those who are involved with interstate commerce? Are they still exempt?
The Fair Labor Standards Act does not apply at all unless the employer is engaged in interstate commerce. That's straight out of the Constitution. As a practical matter, the way they define interstate commerce is it almost happens all the time because almost every product you buy or use comes from some other state. So it's really not an issue. I actually saw a case in the last year where it was one of the first times I ever saw where it didn't apply. It was a small landscaping company in a state. All the stuff was bought local. All the workers were local. And in that particular case, all the customers were obviously local. So in that case, the court said there was no interstate commerce, and the Fair Labor Standards Act did not apply. But I forget what state it was in. Whatever the state law was applied in that particular situation, because the state law doesn't require interstate commerce.
Okay. This one is regarding insurance professionals. Would a licensed 2-20 or 4-40 insurance professional be considered to fall under the white-collar exemption?
Yeah, that's one of those questions I can't answer in a vacuum because you need to look at what, I'm not even sure what those numbers you gave me were, but you need to look at what the person actually does. And there's so many different types of insurance professionals, I really just can't answer that. You need to look at the specific duties, the specific functions, and look at that in conjunction with the regulations and see where they fall. So I just can't I can't answer that question.
Okay. Does it matter how large or small the company is? For example, all non-exempt employees must make $913 per week no matter what other qualifications are met?
No, and it's a great question because we're used to in the employment world, the benefits world, of having thresholds, right? The Americans with Disabilities Act applies if you have 20 employees. Title VII applies if you have 15 employees. Actually, the ADA is 15 as well. It's the ADEA is 20 employees. FMLA is 50 employees. The Fair Labor Standards Act is 1 employee. So unfortunately, there's no relief there.
Okay. And then does this only, let's see, is that only for small business, schools, and nonprofits? I'm not sure. That's all that was with the question.
Yeah, no, there is no numerosity or sort of employee headcount threshold requirement. If you employ workers and there's interstate commerce, then the workers are subject to the act. Okay.
In this day and age with so many telecommuting, this is a question based on that. How about tracking hours for people who work at home in lieu of working in the office, on call, telecommuting?
Yep.
How would that apply?
It becomes a problem. Remember, these rules were written in the 30s when people went to their office or went to their workplace and then left their workplace. It was very easy to track hours. There weren't BlackBerries and iPhones and the internet and everything else. And so it is difficult, and a lot of it is honor system. You have to have checks and balances. You have to have good supervisors. But at the end of the day, and if there's a discrepancy, you should be addressed as real time as possible. And there's all sorts of software out there, in particular for remote employees who can go onto the cloud or use an app and enter their time. The bigger issue, though, there is someone working, and there's been some litigation on this, secretaries, for example, or administrative assistants responding on their iPhones at night to emails. Is that compensable work time or not? And in theory, it is. They're working, they're providing the work, the boss is asking them a question, and it's overtime. How you track that and how you make sure that all gets captured is a harder question. I've had some clients who basically don't allow people to work, certain types of administrative employees to not work off hours. They're not allowed to look at their, to respond by iPhone for that reason. So it creates issues, and you have to just manage it as best you can. And again, a lot of it is having trust in your employees that they're going to be honest and accurate.
Okay, now we have an example of, say, someone who's in accounts payable, making $60,000 a year. They're not falling under the white collar exemption, but they have them as salary exempt. Do they still need to reclassify them?
Well, they have to reclassify them not, if they're making $60,000 right now, they don't have to reclassify them for purposes of, the way you just described it, it sounds like the person is probably non-exempt based on their duties. they pass the salary basis or they pass the salary part, they may not pass, if it's accounts payable, the general rule of thumb is they are non-exempt. So it sounds like there's risk there already with that one. And the question becomes, should we reclassify and stop the bleeding and either, true up the employee and make them whole, hold our breath and hope they don't sue us, or do we just not change anything and hope this employee, resigns at some point and we never have to worry about it again? Those are really the options that you have.
Okay.
But the best way, the best way to put it in that particular situation is you're not in compliance, and that's in and of itself that doesn't mean you're a bad person. That's not bad. People are not in compliance all the time. The question is that a cost benefit or a risk you're willing to take given your current operation? And executives and managerials people make cost risk benefit analysis 100 times a day, and that's just another one.
Okay. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm all set, right, Sam. That was it.
Okay. This next question, it's kind of confusing. Let me see if I can put it into a better way to understand it. Okay, they're asking about a part-time exempt person with a salary of $913 would not meet the requirements. That's the part that is a little unclear. Then they say, however, if the person were full-time, it would meet the requirement. Are there any concerns?
I'm sorry, can you read it just one more time, please?
Okay, I think it's saying if the person is part-time, making a salary of $913 a week, if the person were full-time, it would meet the requirement. Are there any concerns?
Oh, yeah, no. It kind of gets to a question that I typically get, which is, can you prorate the $913 for part-time employees? And the answer is no, you cannot. And I think that's kind of what the question is getting at. So, if you work part-time, 20 hours a week, as a practical matter, you're you're not going to be working overtime very much, so it kind of doesn't matter. But there still could be weeks, even though you work part-time, where there's something going on, you end up working 40 hours that week. You don't prorate the $913 down to for 20 hours. You would still have to make sure they get paid $913 in that particular week.
Okay. Another attendee is asking if you could speak to the fact that even though you cannot dock the pay of an exempt level employee for less than a full day not worked, an employer can deduct the time from the employee's PTO or vacation balance?
Yes, because you're not, yes, I should have actually mentioned that. So in that particular case, someone doesn't show up for half a day or takes a half a day off. If you deduct that from their vacation bank, then you're in compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act because you're still getting compensated for that time, right? So there is no docking of pay per se. It's just a deduction in your vacation bank allowance. But the FLSA said that's okay. The issue is that what if you've used up all your vacation? In that particular situation, you couldn't dock it. In some respects, people get a benefit for using up all the vacation early, because in that case you wouldn't be able to dock their pay unless it was a full day.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, let's see. I think we have time for one more question. And under this one, it looks like they're asking, under tracking exempt employee hours, if their timekeeping system automatically tracks 80 hours, I'm wondering if they're doing a biweekly payroll maybe. Would that suffice in a court of law, or do we need more in-depth tracking of hours?
I mean, if it's not accurate, it wouldn't suffice. I know a lot of systems that do that. It pre-bakes in 40 hours for exempt employees. But even if that record were there and the employee could say that was pre-populated and in that week I actually worked 52 hours and here's the proof, then the record becomes irrelevant. I personally think that I'd rather not have track time at all rather than track time that's not accurate, if that makes sense.
Good point. Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for questions, and this concludes our webinar, and we thank you for attending. Once again, we will send you an email with a link to the recording, and we've been having lots of questions about how to get a copy of the slides. If you want to email us a request, as well as for any questions that you asked that were not answered today, we can get that to you, and that email address is marketing@ecipay.com. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.